Get
She was
out of my
17
way!
minutes from
Do
a
you hear
courtroom
what I am
where she'd
saying?
spend her morning deciding whether a company had discriminated against its own employees. She didn't know yet that before she got there, a stranger would decide to test her patience on a subway platform, and that by the end of the day, his name would be attached to a badge number, a termination letter, and a video with 2 million views. This is the story of the morning Gary Hutchins picked the wrong woman to shove. Before we get into it, drop a comment letting me know what city or state you're watching from tonight. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe, because the story coming up right after this one might be the most satisfying reveal I've ever narrated. You will not want to miss it. Now let's get into this one. Lexington Avenue and 59th Street, 8:12 on a Tuesday morning, and the platform was doing what it always did at rush hour, swallowing people whole. Bodies 3 deep at the edge of the yellow line. Phones tilted down at faces lit blue. A busker somewhere near the stairwell, working through a Marvin gate cover nobody was tipping for. The air smelled like hot brake dust and coffee. Above the tracks, the fluorescent tubes buzzed with that particular flicker that New Yorkers stopped noticing after their first year in the city. Maya Coleman stood near the middle of the platform, tote bag over one shoulder, a manila folder tucked against her side thick enough that anyone glancing at it might have guessed she was headed to an office job. Nothing more. She wore a charcoal coat, flats, hair pulled back simply. If you'd looked at her, really looked, you might have noticed the stillness in how she held herself, a kind of contained attention that didn't match the frantic energy around her. But most people didn't look. That was, in its way, exactly how she preferred it. 34 years old, and for the last 4 months, the Honorable Maya Coleman had sat on the bench of the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York, one of the youngest federal judges in the circuit's recent history. She could have had a car service. Her clerk, a persistent young man named Theo, had brought it up more than once. She always said the same thing: I need to still be a person who rides the train. The day I stop being that, I stop understanding what the people in my courtroom are dealing with. This morning, she was headed downtown to preside over the first day of testimony in a workplace discrimination case, a mid-sized logistics company accused of systematically passing over black employees for promotions while publicly claiming a commitment to equity. She had read the depositions twice. She had opinions she would not voice until the record was complete. That was the discipline of the job, to listen fully before you spoke at all. She had no idea that in the next 90 seconds, she'd be given a live demonstration of the exact behavior she was about to spend 8 hours examining under oath. Gary Hutchins was 11 feet away, and he was having what he'd have described if you'd asked him as one of those weeks. 47 years old, a claims adjuster for a mid-size insurance firm in Midtown, 17 years at the same company. And 2 days ago, he'd watched a coworker 8 years his junior, a sharp, quiet woman named Priya, who'd been there half as long, get the regional promotion he'd been circling for 2 cycles. Nobody had explained it to him in a way he was willing to accept. In his head, the explanation had calcified into something simpler and uglier. They're filling quotas now. It's not about the work anymore. He'd said some version of that out loud to his wife at breakfast. She hadn't responded. That silence had followed him onto the platform. Gary stood close to the doors, phone in hand, jaw tight, replaying the promotion conversation in his mind for the 9th time that morning, sharpening every slight into something personal. He didn't consciously decide to be looking for someone to blame. But when the train doors chimed their warning and the crowd surged forward all at once, and a woman in a charcoal coat happened to be the body directly between him and the closing gap, something in him didn't hesitate, didn't ask, didn't wait the half second a decent person waits. He put his hand flat against Maya's shoulder blade and shoved. Not a jostle, not the accidental collision of 2 bodies moving in a crowd. A deliberate, 2-handed push that sent her stumbling sideways into the man beside her, her tote bag sliding off her shoulder, the manila folder nearly slipping from her grip before she caught it against her hip. The busker's guitar cover kept playing, oblivious. A few heads turned. Most didn't. Maya caught her balance in under a second. She did not gasp. She did not raise her voice. She straightened her coat, resettled the folder under her arm, and turned to look at the man who just put his hands on her in a way strangers do not put their hands on each other. Gary was already stepping past her toward the train, muttering just loud enough to be heard by the cluster of commuters around them. Move. Some of us have somewhere to be. The doors were still open. He hadn't needed to shove anyone. There was room. He'd wanted the space to be his, and he'd taken it the fastest way he knew how. Maya didn't move to board that car. She stood exactly where she was. And when she spoke, her voice carried the particular calm of someone who has spent years in rooms where volume never won an argument. You put your hands on me. Gary turned back, one foot already braced against the train's threshold, holding the door open with his shoulder more out of stubbornness now than urgency. I barely touched you. You were standing in the way. You shoved me into another person, Maya said. I'd like an apology. A few more heads turned now. The particular gravity of a public confrontation was starting to pull attention the way a car crash pulls rubberneckers. Nobody wanting to be involved, everybody unable to look away. A woman near the pillar had already lifted her phone, thumb finding the record button on instinct. The way New Yorkers had learned to do over the last decade whenever something in the air shifted from ordinary to something worth keeping. Gary's face went through a fast, ugly transformation, from irritation to something harder. Something that had been sitting just under the surface since breakfast and was grateful, in some twisted corner of him, for an excuse to come out. He let go of the door. It chimed shut behind him without him, the train pulling away, and for a moment neither of them was going anywhere. An apology, he repeated, and laughed, short, humorless. You people are always looking for something, aren't you? The words landed in the space between them and did not need clarification. Maya didn't flinch. She didn't step back. She held his gaze with the same stillness she'd have brought to a courtroom outburst, filing the moment away with the exact clinical precision she'd trained into herself over a decade of law, not because she needed the memory for herself, but because some part of her, even now, was already thinking about what this would look like written down. Say that again, she said quietly. I want to make sure I understood you correctly. Gary's chest rose, his jaw working, the crowd around them thickening now. Phones lifting, the platform's low collective hum sharpening into something closer to silence, the kind that happens right before people decide whether to intervene or look away. He didn't back down. He stepped closer instead. Gary Hutchins had spent 17 years learning how to project confidence in rooms where he didn't have any, client calls where the numbers didn't add up in his favor, performance reviews where he'd smiled through disappointment, family dinners where he'd nodded along to plans he privately resented. He knew how to make his voice bigger than his certainty. It was, in its way, the only professional skill he'd fully mastered. He used it now. You want to make sure you understood me correctly, he repeated, mimicking her cadence in a way that was clearly meant to sound mocking, though it came out strained. A half octave too high. Yeah, I got somewhere to be. You were standing in my way. That's it. That's the whole story. I don't know why you're trying to turn this into something. I'm not turning anything into anything, Maya said. You put both hands on me and pushed. I was standing on a subway platform, which, as far as I understand it, is a place people are permitted to stand. A ripple of quiet laughter moved through a few of the bystanders. Not loud, just enough to register. Gary heard it, and something in his shoulders squared further. The particular defensiveness of a man who has just realized the room isn't on his side and has decided the solution is volume. Oh, now everybody's a comedian, he said, throwing a hand out toward the small crowd that had gathered without quite meaning to. This is exactly the problem. Everybody's so sensitive now. I bump into somebody by accident on a crowded platform, and suddenly I'm the villain in somebody's little movie. He gestured at the phone the woman near the pillar was still holding up. Yeah, go ahead, film it. Put it on the internet. That's what everybody does now, instead of just living. You didn't bump into me, Maya said, and her voice hadn't risen at all, which seemed, somehow, to unsettle him more than if it had. I'd like you to say the words you said a moment ago, again, so that everyone standing here can hear them clearly. If you believe there was nothing wrong with what you said, you shouldn't have any trouble repeating it. It was a small thing, a lawyer's instinct dressed up as a simple request. Get the witness to restate the claim on the record, in their own words, without the shield of ambiguity. Gary didn't recognize it as a tactic. He only registered that he was being cornered, and cornered men reach for whatever's closest. I said you people are always looking for a reason, he snapped, louder now, no longer bothering to check who was listening. That's what I said. And I'll say it again every single time somebody bumps into somebody in this city, and it turns into a whole production. Race this, discrimination that. I didn't do anything to you because of your skin color. I did it because you were in my way, and I am sick of being the one who has to watch what I say every time I'm having a bad morning. Denise Okafor had been standing a few feet back this entire time, an older woman in a wool coat with a Metro card still pinched between two fingers. Waiting for a train she now had no intention of getting on until this finished playing out. She taught 4th grade in Bed-Stuy for 31 years before retiring, and she had exactly the kind of face that made grown men reconsider what they were about to say, not because it was harsh, but because it looked like it had already decided what it thought of you. Sir, Denise said, stepping forward, her voice carrying the particular authority of someone who has spent 3 decades getting rooms of 9-year-olds to be quiet. I watched you shove that woman with both hands. I was standing right there. So whatever story you're telling yourself right now about what just happened, I'd leave it at the door because we all saw the same thing you did. Gary rounded on her. Nobody asked you. No, Denise agreed evenly, but I'm telling you anyway. That's how this works. The platform had gone from a diffuse crowd of individuals minding their own commutes to something closer to a gallery. A dozen people now, phones raised at various angles, nobody quite willing to step fully into the middle of it. But nobody leaving either. New York had a particular relationship with public conflict. Mostly indifferent, until the indifference tipped, and then it tipped hard. Maya hadn't moved from where she stood. She'd let Gary's second outburst finish completely, every word of it, without interrupting, without flinching, without giving him the reaction that might have let him feel, even briefly, like he'd won something. When he was done, she spoke again. And this time there was something in her tone that hadn't been there before. Not anger. Something closer to precision. You said, and I'm quoting you now, you people are always looking for a reason. I want to make sure that's accurate, because I intend to remember it exactly. Remember it, forget it, I don't care, Gary said. But there was a new thinness in his voice now, the bravado starting to fray at the edges as the reality of a dozen raised phones settled into him. This is insane. I bump a woman on a subway platform and I've got a firing squad. You didn't bump me, Maya said again, quiet and level. You'll want to be precise about that, too, if you're going to keep telling this story. Behind them, another train was pulling into the station, the platform lights flickering against its windows, brakes shrieking in that long metallic groan the 4-line was known for. The doors opened. Nobody in the immediate cluster moved toward them. Whatever had been building on this platform for the last 90 seconds had become, without anyone quite deciding it, more urgent than a train schedule. That was when Gary made the mistake that would end his week very differently than it had started. A young man near the edge of the platform, headphones around his neck, clearly uninvolved, clearly just trying to angle around the gathered crowd to reach the train doors before they closed, brushed past Gary's shoulder in the crush of bodies. It was nothing. The most ordinary contact New York subway platforms produce 1,000 times a day. But Gary, keyed up now, embarrassed, cornered by an audience he hadn't wanted, spun toward him with his hand already rising. Watch it. Maya stepped between them before the sentence finished. Not dramatically. Not with any flourish. She simply moved her body into the gap, one hand lifting, not to touch him, just present, a boundary made visible, and said, in the same even voice she'd used the entire time, "That's enough." Gary's hand, already in motion, caught her forearm instead of the stranger's shoulder. Not a shove this time, but a grab, fingers closing hard enough to leave a mark. His balance thrown by the sudden change in what was in front of him. The platform went silent in the particular way a crowd goes silent when it collectively realizes it just watched something cross a line that can't be uncrossed. The young man with the headphones froze. Denise's hand flew to her phone, angling it higher, closer. Somewhere behind them, someone pulled the intercom panel open and pressed the call button for a transit officer, their voice tight and fast. "We need someone at 59th and Lex. Someone just grabbed a woman." Maya didn't pull her arm away immediately. She looked down at Gary's hand on her forearm, then up at his face, and for the first time since this had started, something in her expression sharpened into total, unmistakable clarity. Not fear, not anger, but the specific look of someone recalibrating exactly how serious a situation had just become. "You should let go of my arm," she said quietly. "Right now." Gary looked down at his own hand as if it belonged to someone else, as if he were only now understanding what he'd done, the platform's collective silence pressing in on him from every direction, a dozen phones still recording, the woman he'd grabbed standing perfectly, unervingly still in front of him. He let go, but it was already too late. Down the platform, moving fast through the parting crowd, a transit officer was closing the distance toward them, radio crackling at her shoulder, and Gary Hutchins was about to learn that the morning he decided to take out on a stranger was not going to end on this platform. Officer Renee Alvarez had worked the Lexington Avenue corridor for 3 years, long enough to develop an instinct for the difference between a subway platform argument that would burn itself out in another 30 seconds, and one that had already crossed into something that needed paperwork. She clocked the second kind from 20 feet away, the raised phones, the silence instead of shouting, the way the crowd had arranged itself into a loose ring instead of dispersing. "Everybody back up, give me some room," she said, moving through the gap the crowd made for her, hand resting near her radio but not on her weapon, her eyes moving fast between the two people at the center of it, a man in a rumpled dress shirt, red-faced, hands now jammed in his pockets like he was trying to physically restrain them from doing anything else, and a woman in a charcoal coat standing with a stillness that Alvarez, 3 years into this job, had learned to recognize as its own. Kind of warning sign. Not fear. Control. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" Alvarez asked Maya first, scanning her forearm, where a faint red mark was already rising against her skin. "I'm fine," Maya said. He grabbed my arm. Before that, he shoved me on the platform when the doors were closing. There are at least a dozen witnesses, and I'd imagine several recordings. "That's not," Gary started, then stopped himself, recalibrating. "Okay, look, this got blown way out of proportion. I was in a hurry. There was a crowd. I might have bumped into her. And then this whole thing turned into, I don't even know what this turned into. She stepped in front of me, and I grabbed her arm because I lost my balance. That's it. That's the whole story." "That's not the whole story," Denise said immediately, stepping forward before Alvarez had even turned to ask. "I saw the whole thing, officer, start to finish." He shoved her with both hands to get to the train doors. When she asked him to apologize, he told her, and these are his exact words, "You people are always looking for a reason." Then, when a young man walked past him, he raised his hand at him too, and she stepped in to stop it, and that's when he grabbed her arm. I've got about 40 seconds of it on video if you want to see it. Alvarez's expression didn't change much, but something behind her eyes sharpened. The particular shift of a cop realizing a scene she'd expected to be simple was not going to be simple at all. "I'm going to want that video," she said to Denise. "And I want your name and number before you go anywhere." She turned back to Gary. "Sir, I need your ID." "This is insane," Gary said, but he was already reaching for his wallet. His hand slightly unsteady now, the adrenaline of the confrontation curdling fast into something closer to panic, as the reality of a uniformed officer, a recording bystander, and a growing crowd settled over him. "I didn't do anything that 50 other people on this platform haven't done on a bad morning. You push through a crowd, you say something you don't mean, and now what? I'm getting arrested." "Nobody said arrested," Alvarez said evenly, taking his license and glancing at it before looking back up. "Right now I'm gathering statements. Sir, can I get your name?" This to Maya, pen already out, notepad flipped open against her palm, the routine procedural rhythm of 100 incident reports she'd filed before. "Maya Coleman," Maya said. Alvarez wrote it down without looking up at first, and then, mid-stroke, she stopped. It was a small thing, a half-second hesitation, pen hovering over the page, her eyes lifting slowly from the notepad to Maya's face, studying it now with a different kind of attention than she'd been giving it 30 seconds earlier. Something about the name had snagged in her memory, and she was chasing it down, sorting through months of case files and courtroom appearances and briefing rooms, until it clicked into place with the force of a physical jolt. Maya Coleman. Alvarez repeated slowly. You're not. She stopped herself, unsure for a moment whether it was appropriate to ask, whether she was about to embarrass herself in front of a subway platform full of strangers. But the instinct was too strong to ignore. I testified in a case back in the spring. Southern District. Were you the judge? The platform, which had already gone quiet once, went quiet again, but differently this time. Not the hush attention, but the hush of information landing somewhere it wasn't expected. Gary went very still. Yes, Maya said simply. That was me. Denise, standing a few feet away with her phone still in hand, let out a short, sharp breath that was almost a laugh. Not amusement exactly, but the release of someone watching a shape she'd half suspected finally come into focus. I knew I recognized you, she said quietly, almost to herself. There was a piece in the Times about your appointment. I remember the photo. Gary's mouth opened, then closed. His eyes moved from Alvarez to Maya and back again. Some fast internal recalculation happening behind them. The math of what he'd said, what he'd done, and who exactly had been standing in front of him this entire time while he said it. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't seem to be able to. I'm a federal judge, Maya said, and her voice hadn't changed at all. No triumph in it, no satisfaction. The same even register she'd used since the moment his hand first landed on her shoulder blade. I was on my way to preside over a discrimination case this morning. I'd ask you to think about that while Officer Alvarez finishes taking her statements. There's a particular kind of silence that settles over a person when the ground underneath them changes shape faster than they can process it. Gary Hutchins stood in that silence now, his license still in Officer Alvarez's hand. The platform crowd around him no longer a faceless audience, but suddenly, in his mind, a jury. You said you were, he tried again. And this time his voice had lost the volume it carried 20 minutes earlier. It had gone thin, almost boyish, the bravado stripped out of it entirely. You didn't say anything. You just stood there and you let this whole thing happen, and you didn't even tell me who you were. Why would I need to tell you who I am for you to treat me like a person? Maya asked. It wasn't rhetorical. She waited, actually waited, as though she wanted him to sit with the question rather than let it pass. Gary didn't have an answer. Alvarez, watching the exchange, gave it a beat before stepping back into procedural rhythm. She had a report to build, and whatever recalibration was happening in Gary's head wasn't her department to manage. Sir, I'm going to need you to stay right here, she said, radioing in a request for a second unit. Her voice dropping into the flat, practiced cadence of someone calling in a confirmed incident rather than a possible one. Based on what I've observed and what witnesses have described, the physical contact, the statements made, the fact that a bystander has video, I have enough to issue you a summons today. Possibly more, depending on what's on that footage. A summons for what? Gary's voice cracked upward again, panic elbowing past his dwindling composure. For bumping into someone? For losing my temper? People lose their temper. That's not a crime. Putting your hands on someone without their consent is, Alvarez said. Grabbing someone's arm is. And depending on what you said to her, we may be looking at harassment in addition to the physical contact. I'm not the one who decides the charges. That's the DA's office. But I am the one writing this report. And right now, what I've got documented is assault, contact, and disorderly conduct minimum. Gary looked around the platform at Denise, still holding her phone with the calm patience of someone who had already sent the footage to 3 group chats before Alvarez had finished writing Maya's name down, at the young man with the headphones who was giving a statement of his own to a second officer just arriving on the scene, at Maya, standing exactly where she'd stood this entire time, not gloating, not even particularly invested in his unraveling, simply waiting for the process to run its course the way she'd waited for processes to run their course for the last decade of her career. This is going to follow me, Gary said, and it wasn't quite a question, more a fact he was saying out loud to see if it was real. That's generally how consequences work, Maya said. Not cruel, not gloating, just true. The second officer arrived, a stockier man named Reyes, and Alvarez briefed him quickly, low-voiced, the two of them falling into the particular shorthand of colleagues who'd worked scenes together before. Reyes glanced at Gary, then at Maya, then did a small double take of his own when he heard the name pass between the two officers. the same recognition rippling through him that had rippled through Alvarez moments earlier. "Judge Coleman," Reyes said, not quite able to keep the surprise out of his voice. "I was in your courtroom for a deposition hearing back in June." "Small city," Maya said, and for the first time since the confrontation started, something almost like warmth touched the corner of her mouth, not for Gary's benefit, but simply the small, human absurdity of it. New York, 8 million people, and somehow this. Gary's face had gone through several colors in the last 90 seconds, red with anger, then the ash white of dawning consequence. And now it settled into something closer to a kind of desperate, scrambling politeness. The tone of a man realizing he needed to change strategies immediately or lose the last scraps of control over how this story ended. "Your Honor," he started, and the title came out of him strange and unpracticed, like a language he'd never expected to need. "Look, I'm sorry. Genuinely. This morning got away from me. I had a bad week. I said some things I shouldn't have said, and I understand that doesn't excuse anything. But I'm asking you, is there a way to just let this go? I have a family. I have a job. This could really hurt me." Maya looked at him for a long moment, long enough that the platform around them seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see which way this would tip. "You didn't apologize until you found out who I was," she said finally, quiet, without heat. "Before that, you told me I was always looking for a reason. I'd like you to sit with the fact that the only thing that changed between those two moments is that you learned my job title. My humanity didn't change. It was the same an hour ago as it is now." Gary opened his mouth, then closed it. There was nothing to say to that which wouldn't make it worse. Alvarez finished writing, tore the summons free, and held it out to him. "Harassment in the second degree, disorderly conduct. You'll get a court date in the mail. I'd strongly recommend you show up with a lawyer." Gary took the paper with a hand that wasn't entirely steady. Around him, the platform crowd, the dozen strangers who'd watched the entire arc of this unfold in real time, had already begun, quietly, to disperse, phones lowering, the ordinary churn of the morning commute reasserting itself now that the drama had reached its procedural conclusion. But nobody who'd watched it would forget it. Denise was already typing a caption for the video she planned to post, something short, something factual, no embellishment needed, because the footage spoke plainly enough on its own. Maya adjusted the folder under her arm, glanced once at the clock on the platform wall, and turned to Alvarez. "I need to get downtown," she said. "I have a courtroom waiting." "Of course, Your Honor," Alvarez said. "We've got your statement. We'll be in touch if we need anything else." Maya nodded, and without another glance at Gary, not out of coldness, but because there was genuinely nothing left to say to him that the summons in his hand hadn't already said more plainly, she walked toward the stairs, toward the next train, toward a courtroom where, in less than an hour, she would sit in judgment of a company accused of exactly the kind of thing she'd just lived through on a subway platform. And she would do it with the same unshaken composure she'd carried through the last 20 minutes. Behind her, Gary Hutchins stood alone on a platform that had, in the space of one train's arrival and departure, entirely rearranged his morning, and was about to rearrange a great deal more. By the time Gary Hutchins made it to his office 40 minutes later, in fact, than he'd been trying to avoid being when he shoved a stranger out of his way, the video already had 11,000 views. He didn't know that yet. He sat at his desk in the claims department on the 14th floor, the summons folded into quarters in his jacket pocket like he could shrink its significance by making it physically smaller, and tried to convince himself the morning had been an aberration, a blip, something that would dissolve back into the ordinary churn of the city by lunchtime. New York forgot things fast. That was supposed to be one of its mercies. It was his co-worker Marcus who found the video first, scrolling through a group chat during a coffee break, and did the very specific double take of recognizing someone he worked with in a clip that had been captioned, simply, * man shoves woman on NYC subway. Has no idea she's a federal judge. *. By 11 a.m., 3 more co-workers had seen it. By noon, someone had sent it to HR, not maliciously, exactly, more out of the low-grade civic instinct that had become standard practice in offices across the country. If there's smoke, you don't have to be the one who calls the fire department, but you make sure somebody knows where the smoke is. Gary was called into a conference room at 1:15 p.m. Two people were waiting for him, Patricia Nguyen, the head of HR, and his direct manager, a soft-spoken man named Elliot Brooks who looked, Gary thought, deeply uncomfortable to be there at all. "We need to talk about a video that's circulating," Patricia said, without much preamble, sliding a laptop across the table, already queued up to the clip. "Would you like to explain what we're looking at?" Gary watched himself on the screen, watched his own hand connect with Maya Coleman's shoulder blade, watched himself say the words you people are always looking for a reason in a voice that sounded, from the outside, uglier than it had felt from the inside. There was no ambiguity in the footage. Denise's angle had captured the shove clearly, the grab clearly, his face clearly, in a wide shot that left no room for the story he'd been rehearsing in his head all morning. The one where this had all been a misunderstanding, a crowded platform, an accident blown out of proportion by people looking for a reason to be offended. "It's not. That's not the whole context," he started. "We watched the whole video, Gary," Elliot said quietly. 41 seconds. "There isn't a version of context that changes what's in it." "I had a bad morning," Gary said, and even as the words left his mouth, he could hear how small they sounded in the room, how insufficient against the footage still frozen on the laptop screen. "I said something I shouldn't have said. I don't actually think that about people. I was angry and it came out wrong." Patricia didn't respond to that directly. Instead, she opened a folder in front of her, a physical one, manila, the kind of prop that in Gary's experience always meant something worse was coming. "I want to be transparent with you about where we are," she said. "This video is currently at, as of an hour ago, over 60,000 views, and it's still climbing. The individual involved has been identified publicly as a sitting federal judge, which means this isn't just an internal HR matter. It's already a reputational issue for the company, given that your LinkedIn identifies you as an employee here. So what, I'm fired? Over a video. You're being placed on unpaid administrative leave, effective immediately, pending a full review," Patricia said. "That review is going to include this incident, but I have to be honest with you, Gary. It's also going to include a look at your broader conduct history here. And I want you to understand that's not me building a case against you preemptively. It's standard practice whenever something like this comes to light, because in my experience, incidents like this are rarely isolated." Gary felt something cold settle in his stomach at that, a specific, targeted dread, because he knew, even if he'd spent years not fully admitting it to himself, that it wasn't the first time. There had been the comment about Priya's promotion, overheard by more people than he'd realized at the time. There had been the joke at the holiday party 2 years ago that had gotten a thin laugh and a longer silence. He'd told himself those were nothing. Normal workplace friction, people being too sensitive. Exactly the framing he'd used on the subway platform an hour before any of this started. "I want to talk to a lawyer before this goes any further," he said finally. "That's your right," Elliot said, not unkindly. "We'll be in touch about next steps. Please leave your badge with security on your way out." He sat in his car in the parking garage for 11 minutes before he could make himself turn the key. His phone had already started buzzing, a text from his brother-in-law with a link and no other words, a missed call from a number he didn't recognize that turned out, when he checked later, to be a local news reporter. He didn't answer any of it. He drove home in silence, replaying the morning on a loop that had already, in the space of 6 hours, stopped being about the subway platform at all and become something much larger, a referendum, playing out in real time, on every version of himself he'd spent years refusing to examine. His wife, Karen, was waiting at the kitchen table when he got home. She hadn't gone to work. Her laptop was open in front of her. The video paused on his own face mid-sentence. "I need you to tell me this isn't what it looks like," she said. Gary sat down across from her, the weight of the entire day finally catching up to him all at once. And for the first time since the platform, he didn't have a version of the story ready to offer. "I don't know what to tell you," he said quietly. "I don't recognize myself in that video, but I know it's me." Karen closed the laptop. She didn't say anything else for a long moment, and the silence in that kitchen was, in its own quiet way, the beginning of a much longer conversation neither of them was ready to have yet. By the time the sun set on Manhattan, the video had a name. It hadn't started that way. Denise Okafor had posted it that same morning with a plain, factual caption, no editorializing, No hashtags chasing virality, just a description of what had happened and where. She wasn't looking to make anything go viral. She was looking to make sure there was a record. But the internet has its own gravity. And by early afternoon, a local news account had picked it up, then a larger aggregator, then a national morning show social media team, each repost stripping away a little more context and replacing it with a punchier headline. Until by 6 p.m. the clip was circulating under a title none of the original participants had chosen. Asterisk. Man shoves black federal judge on NYC subway. Has no idea who she is. Asterisk. Maya saw it for the first time that evening, scrolling briefly before setting the phone face down on her kitchen counter. She hadn't sought it out. Her clerk, Theo, had sent it to her with a single line. Judge Coleman, I think you should see this before someone else shows it to you. And she'd watched the 41 seconds once quietly. Standing in her kitchen still in the blazer, she'd worn to preside over 8 hours of testimony about the exact kind of dehumanization she'd experienced firsthand that morning. She didn't feel triumphant watching it. That surprised her a little. She felt mostly tired. The specific exhaustion of having a private, unpleasant moment converted into public spectacle, no matter how justified the exposure was. She turned the phone back over, texted Theo a brief thank you. I've seen it, and didn't look at it again that night. Gary did not have the luxury of looking away. By the time Karen went to bed, having said very little else to him since the kitchen table conversation that morning, Gary sat alone in his living room with his laptop open, watching the number climb, 60,000, then 140,000, then past 300,000 by midnight. Each refresh a fresh wave of nausea, each comment beneath the video a small, specific indictment. Strangers had identified him by name within hours, cross-referencing a blurry LinkedIn photo against the footage. Someone had found his company's name in his profile. Someone else had found the co-op board he sat on in his Staten Island building and posted a screenshot of the building's public directory with his unit number circled. He didn't sleep that night. Somewhere around 2 a.m., scrolling through comment after comment, he found one from a woman claiming to be a former coworker at a different company he'd worked at 8 years earlier, describing an incident he barely remembered, a comment he'd made in a meeting that she said she'd never forgotten. He stared at it for a long time. He didn't recognize the version of himself she was describing, and that unrecognition, more than the video itself, more than the summons folded in his jacket pocket, was the thing that finally cracked something open in him that he'd spent years keeping welded shut. The internal HR investigation moved faster than Gary expected, propelled by the public pressure that a viral video applies to institutions that would otherwise take their time. Patricia and Gwynn called him back into the office 3 days later. Not the same conference room this time, but a smaller one, which Gary understood, walking in, was its own kind of signal. We've completed our review, Patricia said. There was no laptop open this time, no video to point to. Just a single printed document on the table between them. I want to walk you through what we found, because I don't think this should come as a surprise to you, even though I suspect it might. She slid the document toward him. It listed, in flat institutional language, 2 prior complaints filed against him over the preceding 4 years. One from a coworker regarding comments made during a team lunch. One from an employee in a different department who'd requested to no longer be assigned to projects with him after what the complaint described as a pattern of dismissive and racially charged remarks. Both complaints had been logged. Neither had resulted in formal action. I didn't know about either of these, Gary said, and it was true in the narrow, technical sense. Nobody had ever told him directly. But some other part of him, reading the descriptions, recognized the incidents immediately. The specific comments referenced back to him almost verbatim. Moments he'd filed away at the time as harmless, as jokes, as nothing. They were handled quietly at the time, which in hindsight, I'll be honest with you, was a mistake on this company's part, Patricia said. We should have addressed this pattern years ago, instead of letting individual incidents get resolved in isolation. That's on us. But it also means that what happened on the subway platform wasn't an aberration. It was consistent with a pattern that had already been flagged twice before, internally, and ignored. Gary sat with that for a long moment, the document in front of him feeling heavier than a single sheet of paper had any right to feel. Effective today, your employment with this company is terminated, Patricia said. You'll receive information about severance and benefits continuation by mail. I want to be clear that this decision isn't about the video going viral, even though that's what accelerated the review. It's about what the review found once we actually looked. Gary didn't argue. There was, for the first time in this entire unraveling week, nothing left in him that wanted to. He walked out of the building he'd worked in for 17 years, carrying a cardboard box that held less than he expected it to, a coffee mug, a photo of Karen from a trip to Vermont, a small stack of business cards that no longer meant anything. Outside, the city moved around him exactly the way it had the morning of the subway platform. Indifferent, enormous, entirely unbothered by the fact that his entire understanding of his own life had just been quietly dismantled over the course of 5 days. 6 weeks had passed since the subway platform, and Maya Coleman had settled back into the rhythm that made up most of her life outside the courtroom. The same commute, the same coffee shop on the corner near the courthouse, the same quiet discipline of a woman who had built her entire career on not letting any single moment define the whole of her. The video had long since peaked in its viral cycle, the way these things always did, cresting somewhere past 4 million views before the algorithm moved on to the next outrage, the next spectacle. The next stranger's worst morning turned into content for people who would never know either of their names beyond a headline. But 6 weeks was not long enough for Gary Hutchins. 6 weeks was barely long enough for him to finish sleeping through the nights again. He'd spent the better part of a month in a kind of suspended animation. Mornings he didn't get up for, a search for new employment that kept stalling out the moment a hiring manager ran his name through a search engine. A marriage that had gone quiet in a way that felt less like peace and more like held breath. He'd started seeing a counselor, at Karen's insistence more than his own conviction. And in the sessions, he'd found himself circling back, again and again, to the same central confusion. He didn't think of himself as a bad person. He'd never thought of himself as the kind of man who said the things that video had captured him saying. And yet the footage existed. And yet the pattern in that HR document existed. He was starting slowly, unwillingly, to understand that those two facts had to be reconciled somehow. And that reconciliation was not going to come from anyone telling him it was all a misunderstanding. It was his counselor, in fact, who first raised the idea of the apology, not as a strategy, not as a way to salvage anything, but as something Gary needed to do regardless of whether it changed his circumstances at all. "You keep telling me what this cost you," she'd said in their 4th session. "I haven't heard you talk yet about what it cost her." He thought about that for 2 more weeks before he acted on it. He found out through a public court calendar that anyone could access, which courthouse Maya presided in, and on which days she typically had docket call in the mornings before her chambers closed to visitors. He didn't go to ambush her. He told himself that clearly, repeatedly, on the drive into the city. He wasn't going to corner a federal judge outside her courtroom, wasn't going to create a second viral moment out of the wreckage of the first. He simply wanted, if she was willing, 5 minutes. He waited outside the courthouse on Pearl Street on a Tuesday morning in late October, in a coat too heavy for the weather, because he'd been cold with nerves since 6 a.m., watching security-cleared staff and attorneys move in and out of the building's revolving doors. When Maya finally emerged flanked at a respectful distance by Theo, her clerk, who clocked Gary's presence with an immediate and protective alertness, Gary didn't move toward her fast. He stood where he was, hands visible, and simply said her name, "Judge Coleman." Theo stepped half in front of her on instinct, but Maya put a hand lightly on his arm, a small gesture that said, "I've got this," and looked at Gary with the same unhurried stillness she'd shown him on the subway platform 6 weeks earlier. No fear in it, no particular warmth either, just the calm, assessing patience of someone who had decided, in the space of a breath, that she could handle whatever came next. "Mr. Hutchins," she said. "I'm not here to cause a scene," Gary said quickly. "I know how this looks, showing up outside your work. I've been trying to figure out how to say this for weeks, and I didn't think a letter would feel honest enough, and I don't have any other way to reach you. I just want 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking." Maya studied him for a moment. Theo glanced at her, clearly ready to intervene at the first wrong word, but she gave a small nod, and the two of them stepped a few feet away from the courthouse's main flow of foot traffic, into a quieter pocket near a row of stone planters. "You have 5 minutes," Maya said. Gary exhaled. Some of a rehearsed opening he'd prepared falling away now that he was actually standing in front of her. I lost my job, he started, then immediately shook his head at himself. I'm not telling you that so you feel sorry for me. I'm telling you because I want you to understand I'm not here asking you to undo anything. I know I did this. I've had 6 weeks to sit with what I did, and I'm not going to stand here and tell you it was one bad morning, because I found out afterward that it wasn't. There'd been other complaints. 2 of them before you. I never knew about them, but that's not really an excuse either, is it? Not knowing isn't the same as it not happening. Maya didn't respond immediately, and Gary, unused to silence being allowed to sit unfilled, kept going. The words coming faster now, less rehearsed and more raw. I keep trying to understand why I did it. Not what I said. I know why I said what I said. I've had a counselor walking me through that for weeks. The promotion, the resentment I'd been carrying around and never actually looked at honestly. But the shove. Why I put my hands on a stranger at all. And the truest answer I've got is that I didn't think you'd push back. I think some part of me expected you to just absorb it. Get out of the way, take the comment, not make it a thing. And when you didn't, when you just stood there and asked me to say it again, that's what actually made me angrier. If I'm being honest with you right now in a way I probably should have been a long time ago. I'm sorry. I know that word is cheap after everything. But I mean it, and I wanted you to hear it from me directly, not through a summons or an HR letter or a video caption. Maya let the silence stretch for a moment after he finished, not out of cruelty, but because she wasn't the kind of person to fill space just to make someone else's discomfort end faster. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the same measured quality it had on the platform, but there was something underneath it now, some slight give in the register that hadn't been there before. I appreciate you saying that, she said. I do. I think it took something for you to come here, and I don't think it was easy, and I'm not going to pretend that doesn't matter. She paused. But I want to be honest with you too, because I think you came here for honesty, not comfort. What you're describing, the surprise that I pushed back, the assumption that I just absorb it, that's not really about me specifically. That's a pattern you're describing, a pattern that existed before I ever stood in front of you on that platform, and evidently a pattern that existed with other people too, before it ever got to me. Gary nodded slowly, not arguing. I'm not going to tell you I forgive you, because I don't think that's actually what you need from me right now, and I don't think it's mine to give in the way you might be hoping, Maya continued. What happened to me on that platform is one moment. But what you're describing, the resentment, the assumption, the years of it apparently never getting named until it all came out at once, on me, in public, that's not a moment. That's a pattern. And a pattern doesn't get resolved by one apology outside a courthouse, no matter how sincerely it's meant. It gets resolved by what you do differently over years, not weeks. I believe you're sorry. I don't yet know if you've changed, and honestly, neither do you, not 6 weeks out. Time is going to answer that question, not this conversation. Gary absorbed that, the honesty of it landing harder than either forgiveness or rejection would have. That's fair, he said quietly. I think I knew that before I came here. I just needed to say it out loud to you anyway. I understand that, Maya said, and I hope it helps you genuinely. But I'd encourage you to spend less energy on what I think of you, and more on becoming someone your wife, your future co-workers, and frankly yourself can trust again. That work doesn't involve me at all. She gave him a small, final nod, not warm, not cold, simply conclusive, and turned to walk back toward Theo, who fell into step beside her without a word, the 2 of them disappearing back through the courthouse's revolving doors, leaving Gary standing alone on Pearl Street with the particular, unfinished feeling of a man who had said what he needed to say and received, in return, something more honest and more useful than forgiveness would have been. That evening at home, Karen was waiting at the kitchen table again, a mirror of the scene from 6 weeks earlier, though something in the air between them had shifted since then. Worn thin by weeks of silence and half-conversations that never quite resolved anything. I went to see her today, Gary said, sitting down across from her. The judge. I apologized. Karen looked at him for a long moment. How did that go? About like I deserved, Gary said. She didn't forgive me. She wasn't cruel about it. She just told me the truth, that one apology doesn't undo a pattern. And that time is going to have to answer whether I'd actually changed, not this conversation. He rubbed a hand over his face. She's right, Karen. I know she's right. Karen was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice had a steadiness in it that told Gary she'd been rehearsing this conversation as long as he'd been rehearsing his apology to Maya. I've been thinking a lot the last 6 weeks, she said. Not just about the video. About things you've said around the house for years that I let go because they were easier to let go than to fight about. The comments about your coworkers. The thing you said about Priya's promotion. The way you talk about the neighbors on the board. I kept telling myself it was just venting, just frustration, not who you really are. She paused. But watching that video, watching you say those words to a total stranger, in public, without even the excuse of privacy to hide behind, I don't think it was venting anymore. I think it's who you've let yourself become somewhere along the way, and I don't think I can keep pretending I didn't see it building. Karen, I'm not asking you to argue with me right now, she said gently but firmly. I've made a decision, and I wanted to tell you honestly instead of letting it drag out. I think we need to separate. Not because of the video itself. I want to be clear about that because I know that's what everyone assumes, that some public embarrassment is what broke this. It's not the embarrassment. It's that the video forced me to finally look at a pattern I'd been ignoring for a long time, the same way it forced you to. I just don't think I can be the person standing next to you while you figure out whether you're capable of actually changing. That has to be work you do on your own, not work I supervise. Gary sat with that in silence for a long time, the kitchen quiet except for the tick of a stove clock, and found, to his own surprise, that he didn't have it in him to argue with her either. Some part of him had known this conversation was coming since the moment he'd watched his own hand connect with Maya Coleman's shoulder on a phone screen 6 weeks earlier. He nodded slowly and didn't say anything else that night that either of them would remember later. 6 months is not a long time in the life of a city. The trains still ran the same routes. The same platforms still filled and emptied with the same relentless rhythm twice a day. And if you'd stood at Lexington Avenue and 59th Street on any given Tuesday morning, you would have seen nothing to suggest that anything unusual had ever happened there. That was, in its way, exactly the problem Maya Coleman had spent the intervening months trying to solve. She hadn't set out, in the immediate aftermath of the subway platform, to build anything. In the weeks following the incident, she'd mostly wanted the noise to die down. The reporters who'd requested interviews she declined. The op-eds that used her name as a hook for arguments she hadn't authorized. The strangers who recognized her on the street now and either treated her with an awkward, performative deference or worse, seemed disappointed that she didn't want to relitigate the whole story for their benefit. She was a judge. She valued precision, restraint, the slow architecture of due process over the fast gratification of a viral moment. The video had made her, briefly, into a symbol, and symbols were not something she'd ever wanted to be. But something had stayed with her that she couldn't quite let go of, and it wasn't the shove itself, or even the words Gary Hutchins had said to her. It was smaller than that, and in some ways more troubling. It was the 11, maybe 12 seconds between the moment he pushed her and the moment the first bystander lifted a phone. The gap where a dozen people on that platform had watched a woman get shoved and did nothing, said nothing, waited to see how it would resolve before deciding whether it was their business. Denise had stepped forward. Denise had been the exception, not the rule. And Maya, turning the memory over in the months that followed, found herself less interested in Gary's punishment, which had proceeded through the courts in its own separate, orderly track, than in that gap. The silence before the intervention. The bystanders who filmed but didn't speak. The system that existed, in theory, to protect people in public spaces, and how thin that protection actually was in practice until a viral video forced institutional attention onto a single, isolated incident. She began meeting, informally at first, with contacts she had at the MTA and within the NYPD's Transit Bureau. Conversations that started as her simply asking questions, trying to understand what existing protocols governed bystander intervention and de-escalation training for transit workers, and grew, over several months, into something more structured. By spring, what had started as a series of coffee meetings had become the framework for a pilot program. a joint MTA-NYPD Transit Bureau initiative focused on bystander support training, conflict de-escalation for transit staff, and the piece Maya cared most about, a public awareness campaign aimed not at punishing bad actors after the fact, but at making it easier and more normal for ordinary commuters to intervene safely in the moment, rather than defaulting to recording and hoping someone else would act. She hadn't wanted her name attached to it publicly. That had been a point of genuine friction with the MTA's communications office, who saw an obvious opportunity in linking a judge who'd survived a viral incident of public harassment to a program addressing exactly that. Maya had pushed back for weeks, uncomfortable with the idea of her own experience becoming the public face of an institutional initiative. In the end, she'd compromised. Her name would appear in the program's founding documentation, available to anyone who looked, but she would not be doing press for it, would not be the spokesperson, would not turn the program into an extension of her own story. The work would have to stand on its own. Officer Alvarez, who had been the first responding officer that morning 6 months earlier, became one of the pilot program's lead trainers, a role she'd approached with the same procedural seriousness she brought to everything, treating the training curriculum with the rigor of something that might actually save someone from the kind of ordeal Maya had gone through. The thing that stays with me from that morning, Alvarez said in an early training session, addressing a room of about 30 transit workers and volunteer community members, isn't the man who did the shoving. It's how long it took anyone around him to say something. That's not a criticism of the people on that platform. Most people freeze. That's normal. That's human. But we can train people out of the freeze. We can give them language, give them a script for the first 10 seconds, and that changes outcomes. The program structure was, by design, unglamorous. It wasn't a headline-grabbing policy overhaul. It was a series of half-day training sessions rolled out across transit hubs, laminated cards distributed at information booths with simple, actionable language for bystanders. Name what you see. Ask if they're okay. Offer to stay until help arrives. A hotline number transit workers could quietly text if they needed backup during an escalating situation, and a partnership with several community organizations to recruit volunteer platform ambassadors trained in basic de-escalation, stationed at high-traffic stations during rush hour. Maya visited one of the training sessions in April unannounced, sitting quietly in the back of a room rather than at the front, watching Alvarez walk a group of new volunteers through a role-play exercise. She didn't introduce herself to the group. She simply watched, taking in the specific, granular work of turning a viral moment of public cruelty into something durable. Not a punishment, not a symbol, but infrastructure. A dozen small interventions that might over years add up to platforms where the gap she'd experienced, those 11 silent seconds, closed a little faster, a little more often, for people who didn't have a judgeship to fall back on when the system needed a reason to take them seriously. After the session ended, Alvarez found her near the back of the room. "You didn't have to come," she said, "but I'm glad you did." "I wanted to see what it actually looked like," Maya said. "Not the press release version. The real one." "It's slower than anyone wants it to be," Alvarez admitted. "We've trained maybe 400 people so far. That's 400 people out of a system that moves millions of commuters a day. It's a drop in an ocean." "Most real change is a drop in an ocean," Maya said. "The mistake is thinking that means it doesn't matter." She left the training session that afternoon without fanfare, taking the same subway line home she always took, standing in the same kind of crowded car she'd stood in the morning everything had started. And if any of the commuters around her recognized her from the video that had, by then, mostly faded from public memory the way all viral moments eventually do, none of them said anything. She preferred it that way. The work she'd built didn't need her face attached to it to matter. It only needed to still be running, quietly, in stations across the city, the next time someone needed it. And the time after that, and the time after that, long after anyone remembered exactly why it had started. A year had passed since the morning on the Lexington Avenue platform, and Denise Okafor had become, without ever quite planning to, one of the most reliable volunteer trainers in the bystander support program Maya Coleman had helped build. It hadn't started as a calling. It had started in the weeks after her video was viewed millions of times, as a kind of restlessness. The sense that filming something and posting it, however necessary that had been in the moment, wasn't actually the same thing as doing something. She'd taught fourth grade for 31 years. She knew the difference between watching a problem and addressing it, and once the initial adrenaline of the viral moment faded, she found she couldn't shake the feeling that she owed the platform and the people who wrote it every day more than a video caption. She'd reached out to the MTA's Community Engagement Office almost by accident, asking a question about the new training initiative she'd heard about through a neighbor. And within 2 months, she was sitting through the same de-escalation curriculum Officer Alvarez had helped design, then volunteering as an ambassador 1 morning a week at her regular station. Then, as her natural talent for the work became obvious to everyone around her, being asked to help train new volunteers herself. There was something almost inevitable about it, in hindsight. 3 decades of managing a classroom full of 9-year-olds had given her exactly the skills that the program needed. The ability to read a room fast, to speak with calm authority without raising her voice, to make people feel steadied rather than lectured. On a Thursday morning in late September, a documentary crew working on a piece about grassroots transit safety initiatives set up a small camera in the corner of a community room in Midtown, where Denise was leading a training session for a new cohort of volunteer ambassadors. 11 people, ranging from college students to retirees, all of whom had signed up after hearing about the program through word of mouth or a flyer posted at their local station. Maya was not in the room. She had, by that point, stepped back almost entirely from any visible involvement in the program's day-to-day operations, checking in occasionally through Alvarez, but otherwise trusting the infrastructure she'd helped establish to run without her, which was, in its own way, the entire point. A program that depended on one person's continued presence to function wasn't really infrastructure at all. It was just a monument to that person. The documentary crew asked Denise, during a break in the training session, whether she'd noticed any real change on the line she rode most mornings, the same Lexington Avenue corridor, where everything had started a year earlier. Denise considered the question seriously, the way she considered most questions, rather than reaching for the easy, camera-ready answer. "I want to be honest with you," she said, "because I think the honest answer is more useful than the tidy one. It's not like the culture on that platform flipped overnight into something perfect. People still have bad mornings. People still say things they shouldn't say to strangers. I'm not going to sit here and tell you racism disappeared off the 4 line because we handed out some laminated cards." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "But I have seen something change, and it's not small, even if it's not dramatic either. I've seen it happen at least 4 times myself in the last year, standing on that platform during a training shift. Somebody starts escalating, raised voice, somebody getting in someone else's space. And instead of that circle of silence I remember from a year ago, where everybody just watches and nobody moves, I've watched 2 or 3 people step in. Not confrontationally, just present, asking the person being targeted if they're okay, asking the other person to take a breath. Standing there, so it's not just one person against a crowd of onlookers anymore." "Do you think that's because of the training specifically?" the interviewer asked. "Or is it something else, maybe just increased awareness, after that video went viral?" "Probably both, honestly," Denise said. "I'd be lying if I said one video changed a whole transit system. But I think what the video did was crack something open, make people willing to admit the gap existed in the first place. And then the training gave people an actual tool to do something with that awareness, instead of just feeling bad about it and scrolling past the next video. Awareness, without a tool, just turns into guilt, and guilt doesn't help anybody standing on a platform in the moment. You need both." She thought for another moment, and then added something that hadn't been part of any script, something that came, visibly, from a place of genuine reflection rather than performance for the camera. "There's a woman I trained about 4 months ago, young woman, maybe 24, worked retail near Grand Central. She came up to me after a session and told me she'd use the script we teach, the name it, ask if they're okay, offer to stay approach, just 2 weeks after her training, on a platform not far from where all this started. Some man was harassing an elderly woman about how slow she was walking. This young woman just walked up, stood next to the older woman, said, 'Hi, I'm right here, are you okay?' Didn't even address the man directly, didn't escalate anything. and she told me the whole thing just deflated. The man muttered something and walked off. No video. No summons. No viral moment. Just a scared woman who felt less alone for 30 seconds. And a situation that ended quietly instead of getting worse. Denise looked directly into the camera for the first time since the interview started. That's the actual goal, in my opinion. Not another viral video. Fewer situations that need one in the first place. The interviewer asked one more question, whether Denise had ever spoken again with Judge Coleman since that morning a year earlier. Once, Denise said. She came to one of my training sessions in the spring, sat in the back, didn't make a thing of it. Afterward, she thanked me. Not for the video, which I think she still has complicated feelings about, understandably. She thanked me for staying afterward, for giving my statement, for not walking away once the moment passed. She said most people give 5 minutes of outrage and then move on with their day, and what actually changes things is the people who stay for the paperwork. Denise smiled slightly at the memory. I told her the same thing back, that most people who go through what she went through disappear afterward, understandably, because they've done their part just by surviving it. But she stayed too. She built something out of it instead of just letting the internet forget about her in a week, which is what everybody expected to happen, myself included. The documentary crew wrapped their interview shortly after, thanking Denise for her time, packing their equipment while the volunteer cohort filtered back into the room for the second half of the training session. Denise took her position at the front of the room again, clipboard in hand, and began walking the new ambassadors through the role-play exercises Alvarez had designed a year earlier. The same 11-second gap she and Maya had both, independently, identified as the real problem that morning on the Lexington Avenue platform, now being closed, volunteer by volunteer, training session by training session, in a way that no single viral video could have accomplished on its own. By the second anniversary of the morning on the Lexington Avenue platform, the bystander support program that had started as a handful of coffee meetings between a judge and a transit officer had expanded well beyond the borders of the system where it began. What had once been a modest pilot, for 100 trained volunteers, a handful of laminated cards, a hotline number scrawled on flyers at a dozen stations, had grown, through the unglamorous, compounding work of 2 years, into something that other cities had started calling to ask about. It started with Philadelphia. A transit safety coordinator there had read a trade publication article about the MTA, NYPD Transit Bureau Initiative, buried on page 14 between a piece on fare gate technology and one on accessibility upgrades, and had reached out to Alvarez directly, asking whether the curriculum could be adapted for SEPTA's regional rail system. Alvarez, who by then had become the de facto institutional memory of the entire program, spent a weekend putting together a packet, the training modules, the bystander scripts, the volunteer recruitment framework, and sent it along without much expectation that anything would come of it. Something did. Philadelphia launched its own pilot within 6 months. Then Chicago's CTA reached out after seeing a regional news segment about the Philadelphia rollout, then a smaller program in Atlanta. Then interest from transit authorities in 3 more cities that hadn't gotten past the exploratory conversation stage but were, by the 2-year mark, actively drafting proposals. None of these programs carried Maya Coleman's name. None of them needed to. What had traveled from city to city wasn't a person or a story. It was a method, a specific, replicable approach to closing the gap between witnessing harm and doing something about it. Distilled down into training modules and laminated cards that worked whether or not anyone using them had ever heard of a subway platform in Manhattan or the woman who'd stood on it 2 years earlier. Maya followed the program's expansion mostly from a distance, the way she'd followed its growth from the beginning, checking in periodically, offering guidance when Alvarez or the MTA's engagement office asked for it, but otherwise keeping the deliberate remove she'd insisted on from the start. Her caseload had grown heavier that year. She'd been assigned to a high-profile civil rights case that occupied most of her attention through the winter and into spring, and there were stretches of 2 or 3 months where she didn't think about the platform, or Gary Hutchins, or the video at all, which she counted, privately, as its own kind of success. The measure of whether something had actually healed, she'd come to believe, wasn't whether you could talk about it without discomfort. It was whether you could go days, then weeks, without needing to talk about it at all, because it had stopped being the organizing fact of your life and become, instead, simply one part of a much larger one. She heard about Gary only occasionally, and always secondhand. Alvarez mentioned once, almost a year after the incident, that he'd completed the court-mandated anti-bias program as part of his plea agreement, not with any particular fanfare, just a checked box in a file somewhere. Later, through an offhand comment from Theo, who'd apparently stayed loosely in touch with someone who knew Gary's former employer, Maya learned he'd eventually found work again, in a smaller firm, in a role several rungs below what he'd held before. She felt no particular satisfaction hearing it, and no particular sympathy either. It simply existed, a fact about a man whose life had once intersected with hers for 11 minutes on a subway platform and had gone, since then, in a direction she had no further stake in tracking. What she did think about on the 2-year anniversary itself was the ripple, a word Alvarez had used once, early in the program's life, to describe what they were hoping to build, and which had stuck with Maya ever since. A single incident, isolated and cruel, thrown into a system large enough to absorb it without consequence. That was the default outcome, the one that happened 1,000 times a day in cities across the country without ever producing anything beyond the immediate harm to the person it happened to. What made the platform different, what had turned 11 minutes of humiliation into something that traveled outward instead of simply dissipating, was the deliberate, unglamorous work of turning a single bad morning into infrastructure. Training modules, laminated cards, volunteer ambassadors, standing quietly on platforms in cities Maya had never visited, closing gaps she would never personally witness closing. By the 2nd anniversary of the morning on the Lexington Avenue platform, the bystander support program that had started as a handful of coffee meetings between a judge and a transit officer had expanded well beyond the borders of the system where it began. What had once been a modest pilot, for 100 trained volunteers, a handful of laminated cards, a hotline number scrawled on flyers at a dozen stations, had grown, through the unglamorous, compounding work of 2 years, into something that other cities had started calling to ask about. It started with Philadelphia. A transit safety coordinator there had read a trade publication article about the MTA, NYPD Transit Bureau Initiative. Buried on page 14, between a piece on fare gate technology and one on accessibility upgrades, and had reached out to Alvarez directly, asking whether the curriculum could be adapted for SEPTA's regional rail system. Alvarez, who by then had become the de facto institutional memory of the entire program, spent a weekend putting together a packet, the training modules, the bystander scripts, the volunteer recruitment framework, and sent it along without much expectation that anything would come of it. Something did. Philadelphia launched its own pilot within 6 months. Then Chicago's CTA reached out after seeing a regional news segment about the Philadelphia rollout, then a smaller program in Atlanta, then interest from transit authorities in 3 more cities that hadn't gotten past the exploratory conversation stage but were, by the 2-year mark, actively drafting proposals. None of these programs carried Maya Coleman's name. None of them needed to. What had traveled from city to city wasn't a person or a story. It was a method, a specific, replicable approach to closing the gap between witnessing harm and doing something about it, distilled down into training modules and laminated cards that worked whether or not anyone using them had ever heard of a subway platform in Manhattan or the woman who'd stood on it 2 years earlier. Maya followed the program's expansion mostly from a distance, the way she'd followed its growth from the beginning, checking in periodically, offering guidance when Alvarez or the MTA's engagement office asked for it, but otherwise keeping the deliberate remove she'd insisted on from the start. Her caseload had grown heavier that year. She'd been assigned to a high-profile civil rights case that occupied most of her attention through the winter and into spring, and there were stretches of 2 or 3 months where she didn't think about the platform, or Gary Hutchins, or the video at all, which she counted, privately, as its own kind of success. The measure of whether something had actually healed, she'd come to believe, wasn't whether you could talk about it without discomfort. It was whether you could go days, then weeks, without needing to talk about it at all, because it had stopped being the organizing fact of your life and become, instead, simply one part of a much larger one. She heard about Gary only occasionally, and always secondhand. Alvarez mentioned once, almost a year after the incident, that he'd completed the court-mandated anti-bias program as part of his plea agreement, not with any particular fanfare, just a checked box in a file somewhere. Later, through an offhand comment from Theo, who'd apparently stayed loosely in touch with someone who knew Gary's former employer, Maya learned he'd eventually found work again, in a smaller firm, in a role several rungs below what he'd held before. She felt no particular satisfaction hearing it, and no particular sympathy either. It simply existed, a fact about a man whose life had once intersected with hers for 11 minutes on a subway platform and had gone, since then, in a direction she had no further stake in tracking. What she did think about on the 2-year anniversary itself was the ripple, a word Alvarez had used once, early in the program's life, to describe what they were hoping to build, and which had stuck with Maya ever since. A single incident, isolated and cruel, thrown into a system large enough to absorb it without consequence. That was the default outcome, the one that happened 1,000 times a day in cities across the country without ever producing anything beyond the immediate harm to the person it happened to. What made the platform different, what had turned 11 minutes of humiliation into something that traveled outward instead of simply dissipating, was the deliberate, unglamorous work of turning a single bad morning into infrastructure. Training modules, laminated cards, volunteer ambassadors, standing quietly on platforms in cities Maya had never visited, closing gaps she would never personally witness closing. 2 years is long enough to test whether a moment was a turning point or just a story people liked telling themselves for a season. By the time this story reaches its natural end, the internet has long since moved on to other viral clips, other names, other mornings gone wrong on other platforms in other cities. That's what makes what actually happened here worth telling all the way through, not the 11 minutes of confrontation that made the video, but the 2 years that came after it, the part nobody clips and reposts, because slow change doesn't perform well in a 41-second window. Gary Hutchins lost the things a person loses when a pattern they'd spent years not examining is finally dragged into daylight all at once. His job, his marriage, the easy assumption that his frustrations were always somebody else's fault. None of it was undone by his apology outside the courthouse, and it shouldn't have been. An apology is not a receipt you exchange for consequences. It's the beginning of a much longer accounting, one that only time and consistent behavior can actually settle. And Maya Coleman, in the one conversation she gave him, told him that plainly, without cruelty and without false comfort. What happened to him afterward, the smaller job, the quieter life, the slow, private work of a man trying to become someone his own family could trust again, happened without her involvement, because it was never hers to manage. That, too, is a kind of justice, not vengeance handed down by the person who was wronged, but consequence allowed to run its own course, separate from forgiveness, separate from spectacle. Maya never asked to become a symbol, and to her credit, she refused to stay one. She could have spent the 2 years after that platform doing interviews, writing an op-ed, building a public persona out of what had happened to her. The culture rewards that kind of thing generously, turns survivors into brands if they let it. She chose something slower and less visible instead, a training program that doesn't carry her name, run by people like Officer Alvarez and Denise Okafor, who show up to community rooms and platform information tables week after week without cameras following them, doing the unglamorous work of closing an 11-second gap that most commuters will never notice was ever open. That's the real reveal of this story. If there is one beyond the obvious, not that an ordinary-looking woman on a subway platform turned out to be a federal judge, but that she used the authority that came with that revelation not to punish more, but to build something that would outlast her own involvement in it. And Denise, who filmed 41 seconds because she refused to let a moment disappear into he said she said, and who then did the harder thing of staying, testifying, training, showing up long after the algorithm stopped caring. Denise is maybe the quietest hero of this story, and the most instructive one. Because the truth this story keeps circling back to is that most of us aren't going to be Maya Coleman. We aren't going to have a judgeship in our back pocket the next time we watch someone get shoved on a platform. But every single one of us can be Denise. Every one of us can be the person who says out loud in front of a crowd of strangers who'd rather look away, "I saw what happened, and I'm not going to pretend I didn't." That's the part of this story worth carrying with you longer than the satisfaction of watching Gary Hutchins's face change when he learned who he'd shoved. The reveal is the fun part, the part that makes for a good video. But the actual work, the part that changes anything beyond one man's very bad week, is the unglamorous, unrecorded, unviral work of people deciding, one small moment at a time, that silence isn't neutral. That the 11 seconds between witnessing harm and doing something about it are the seconds that decide what kind of platform, what kind of subway car, what kind of city we actually live in. If this story moved you even a little, I'd ask you to think about your own 11 seconds, the moment on a train, in a parking lot, in a break room, where you had the chance to say something and the silence felt easier. None of us get that moment back. But we get the next one. Thank you for watching all the way to the end of this one. It means more than you know. If you want more stories like this, hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. And drop a like if this one hit the way it was meant to. I've got 2 more stories queued up that I think you're going to want to see. One about a teacher who's underestimated by an entire school board. And another about a delivery driver who turns out to be a lot more than anyone on his route expected. Both of them are coming soon, so stay close. I'll see you in the next one.